Hi everybody, thanks for turning up. Thanks for coming along on a sunny evening. It wasn't like this morning when we set off, but enough about that. Sorry for the helmet line. We literally got back off the ride maybe about an hour ago. So I'm an artist based here in Preston, and for the last year or so I've been working with In Certain Places on both the expanded and connected city as part of the City Deal programme that's happening throughout the area. Cycling is something that I've always done throughout my whole life really. I find it the most enjoyable way to travel, and it's how I kind of first explored the district when I arrived here maybe 15 years ago. So I'd kind of like to give you a little bit of background information about some of my thoughts behind the project before we kind of go into talking about cycling fully, as we no doubt will. My initial focus within the programme looked at kind of viewpoints of Preston and the routes taken by bicycle to these kind of often nondescript, remote roads on the periphery of the city. This research kind of became a series of photographs, drawings and kind of mapped routes really, which I reproduced in a publication. There is some on the side if anyone hasn't seen it. It was distributed throughout town at bike shops, cafes and some of the art venues. My work has always kind of had elements which kind of revolve around how we interact and move around the built environment. And I was kind of keen to use this love of architecture and cycling to look at the city from afar. I kind of also think that cycling is kind of inextricably linked to like grand ideas of landscape. So you know, most of the great touring races came about because they were there to kind of promote the landscape that the riders were travelling through, the racers were travelling through. And I think because of the act of riding a bike, you kind of become very aware of the terrain and of the weather and of distances involved, and it kind of affords you to travel at a pace by which the land becomes both measurable and memorable. So I kind of set out with my cameras and some parameters in regard to location to essentially take photographs with Preston as the subject. Britain has a long history, kind of an obsession really, with landscape and notions of the vista, romanticism and the sublime. We know Turner travelled up and down the country looking for views to paint, and Wordsworth, Bronte sisters kind of all wrapped the northern landscape into their writing. And I think looking through the archive at the Harris, it kind of revealed an amazing amount of Preston panoramas, especially kind of during the Victorian era. You know, there's so many. There was kind of so many prints that kind of came out for, around that time. People kind of capturing that sudden rush of modernity and the expanding industrialisation of the town. So a lot of these classic notions were kind of feeding into the classic notions of landscape were kind of feeding into the project to a certain extent, especially with Preston being in this kind of moment of expansion. Most of my photographs, although focusing on the urban, you can probably see behind you there, they're kind of taken from the rural or the semi-rural. And looking over them, I kind of realised that although the perspective is essentially true, parallax skews the makeup of the city, and it kind of creates a deceptive impression of how architecture sits in proximity to itself, to one another. It kind of creates a visual portrait, but from many profiles. And although essentially accurate, it kind of gives a false view of the structure of the built environment. And kind of this discord between what is seen and the reality of objects is kind of what I find quite interesting to look at. It's kind of how we measure distance from afar and the reality of how far we can travel and how those distances are kind of perceived. The routes themselves, which kind of began as a byproduct of searching out these viewpoints, became a mental network of kind of vital arteries out of the city, which were either quick, safe or pleasant. And this in turn forced me to question the infrastructure within the city for cycling and how easy or difficult it is to travel in and out of the centre. And so kind of for the second part of the programme, excuse me, the connected city, my research is looking at aspects of Preston's infrastructure and the services it offers the person travelling by bicycle. I'm looking at both the positive and negative aspects. So, you know, things like the guild wheel and cycle paths, but also maybe things like black spots, accident black spots. As Preston kind of slowly evolves, and with work planned around the university campus to better connect it to the city centre, I would like to look at kind of the role cycling will play in moving us kind of around the city for future generations. What I've also brought with me today is a map of Preston. It's like the guild wheel map, but I know that some of you here are cyclists, I hope, and some of you here will probably travel by bike regularly. If possible, towards the end of the evening, if you could go and mark on the map your usual frequent route, maybe your commute, and also if you could circle any areas that maybe are causes for concern or any areas that you think that you have issues with. It'd be really, really handy for my research. But we'll tackle that later, maybe towards the end of the evening. So we're lucky enough to have invited Jack down to go cycling and to come and speak with us tonight. I could give you an introduction, Jack, but it might just be easier if you just take it away. Cause you
Yeah, well, thanks, Gavin, and thanks, Charles and Rachel, for bringing me here to Preston. I've enjoyed a short time here, and what do we do? 60 miles in the countryside and the city, in and out of the city in the sunshine and the rain, which was a lot of fun. Could have just carried on going and probably missed this event altogether. But no, so I present. I started presenting a radio programme about cycling on an art radio station in London called Resonance FM in 2004, and I thought it was just going to be like a couple of shows. They have quite an open access policy for the station, and I thought, oh well, the Tour de France is happening, we should have an hour on the radio station looking at art related to cycling, poetry, literature, song, and I'll put it all together somehow. And then the first was really fun to do, and people seemed to like listening to it. And then I did another one, and then it just became a regular half hour. And I just thought that kind of art and creativity and cycling were really linked, both in terms of kind of professional artists who often, see which is an awful word, but you know what I mean, people who are artists by their profession often travel by bike, partly because, you know, sometimes artists don't have a huge amount of money, and so a bicycle is free transport. But then even if they do become very successful, they still enjoy the feeling of riding by bike and the freedom and the stimulation that it provides. And so it was a really good entree into a way of thinking about cycling and thinking about art, architecture, urban design, landscape, music, poetry, literature, that is quite unusual in terms of the way people think about cycling in this country particularly, which is as a kind of sport or a keep fit activity. And so yeah, just kind of continue from there. And then I started developing this mode of interviewing people on the bike, which we did a little bit of today, although we didn't actually do any while we were riding along because it was raining quite a lot, and then the recorder got wet and we had to dry it out in the cafe, which did work again, but then we were in a bit of a rush to get back here, so we didn't do any kind of actual recording while we were cycling, which is a shame. But I do remember, like, one of the most memorable early rolling interviews, as I started to call them, was with Jeremy Deller, just after he'd won the Turner Prize. So that would have been in 2005, something like that. And he dedicated his win, his victory or whatever, to London cyclists. There had been a spate of people who had been killed on bikes, and one of the things that he had put up was a memorial to a cyclist who was killed in Islington on Essex Road, which is a busy road. And it was a kind of interesting. It was part of his Turner Prize submission, and it was a tiny little black silhouette of a bicycle. You know, the classic logo of a bicycle made out of black perspex, and it was on a lamppost about 15 feet high in the air on the Essex Road, just near where he died. This bike mechanic who worked at a bike shop there, and it was very kind of invisible, which it's an interesting thing to have an invisible memorial, because memorials are usually meant to be visible, like a great big thing that says this is something important, look at it. But cycling is kind of an invisible form of transport in some ways. It's very light on the ground. It's invisible to a lot of urban planners and transport planners, unfortunately, who don't provide for it. But you've kind of got a fleetness of foot, and so anyway, he dedicated his win to the London cyclists, and I just kind of, I don't know how I got his email address, but I got his or phone number or something like that, and I just said, will you come on my radio show on Resonance FM to talk about it? And he was like, oh yeah, that sounds great. Come to my studio and we'll go for a ride. And I had a friend at that point who was working on the Today programme for Radio 4, and they'd been trying to get Jeremy Deller on the Today programme, and he'd been saying, no, not at all. And so apparently he'd actually done no kind of media, mainstream media, about his Turner Prize thing, because I think, like many artists, they want the work to speak for itself. They don't want to be interpreting it. I had this problem with Gavin on our ride today, trying to get him to talk about his work. But I'm glad he finally did it.
You beat it out of me
now. So anyway, yeah. So we went for a ride, and I almost fell into the canal because I was holding the microphone in one hand and going down these steep cobbled horse paths to the canal, so then this thing, I realised that there's going to be, like, every conversation I had led to 3 or 4 more ideas for future conversations, which is kind of the way it is often when you kind of immerse yourself in something and you follow your own interests, and you're not following a commercial interest, because Resonance is a kind of volunteer-run radio station, basically. And over the time, this is going to sound a bit grandiose, but all those sea creatures that died in the warm oceans that used to cover Britain and sank to the bottom of the ocean and piled up. And there's now the South Downs and the Wessex Ridgeway and all this chalk country of southern England. That is kind of how the Bike Show has sort of accrued all this stuff. And you were saying it's like an archive of cycling culture in London and Britain and the world, to the extent which I've been able to reach out to those places over the last 15 years, 14 years or so. And I wouldn't say it's a comprehensive archive. And in fact, part of the good thing about it is it's not comprehensive. It's quite, to use that awful word, eclectic. It's quite hit and miss. And there are some things you'll be interested in, and there's some things you won't be interested in. So we cover, stuff like, did cycling cause the end of Kraftwerk, the German electronic pop band? We've covered the push bike architecture treasure hunt, which is like a project in London to look at, where you've got a map, like a kind of weird origami map that you folded out and rode your bike around as many brutalist London architectural landmarks as you can on your bike, and it's like a little game. I don't know. I mean,
yeah,
you probably can remember some.
I'm trying to think of them.
Unmemorable episodes.
And I mean, you cover some really kind of like niche subject. So you've managed to get so many kind of experts in their field on who just happen to cycle and probably not really interested in cycling outside of it just being a form of transport. So whether that is the expert that you had in on like hidden histories and landscape. And,
Marianne.
Or like a botanist. I know that there was one episode then when you were kind of really just focusing on the kind of plants that you would see by the side of the road, and it's things like that kind of feed into it. So the bicycle really is just this kind of thing in the background that allows you to investigate and explore all these other subjects.
It's the jumping off point.
Yeah,
I mean, it's the stuff that, I mean, I'd love to do a program on brass rubbing in churches or something like that, because I'm often, like Philip Larkin, kind of go into a church, because it's a kind of interesting thing to do when you're cycling around the countryside, just to stop and have a rest and just go into this place, which is a kind of interesting place. I mean, I'm not Christian, but still, they're a great repository, as you know, of art and history and social history and all sorts of craft and all sorts of things. And I mean, anything. I mean,
you quite like the entrances, I believe you said.
Yeah, I was thinking that if you're ever short of a place to stay, because I often, when I'm cycling and touring, I sleep out just in a sleeping bag, kind of by the side of the road or in a field or whatever. But if it was raining, then a kind of church porch is got a good length to it, and it's undercover, and sometimes there's a little door or a gate or something to keep the beasts out. You could just bed down in there. What would happen if you bedded down in a church porch? I mean, you wake up at 6 or 7 the next morning, and you'd either be gone by the time anyone turned up, or they'd take pity on you and invite you in for a toast.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, why not a cup of tea? Something you said before that I thought was quite interesting was to do with the Jeremy Deller work that recognised then as a memorial by the side of the road of a cyclist death. I also think that one kind of interesting side to cycling is the fact that, like, today we saw plaques by the side of the road that kind of celebrate and commemorate cyclists, which is quite a rare thing. You're so used to seeing flowers by the side of the road, and you get that sinking feeling of another road death. But then also cycling has this, this kind of celebration at the top of some of the climbs, and we saw, like I said, numerous ones today. And I think that's quite a nice thing to kind of recognise, and it's an interesting side of the culture.
I mean, there is a sort of fellowship. It's an old Clarion cycling, the old Clarion Club cycling word. The Clarion cycling clubs, for those of you who don't know, were I did a show on it. They were the kind of early socialist cycling clubs that went out in the countryside and delivered the Clarion, which was a socialist pamphlet, a newspaper of the time. So this is kind of 1890s, early 1900s sort of news from nowhere type of era about like fomenting a better world, maybe. And the bicycle was kind of a means to distribute for the paper for these people. But their motto of the Clarion cycling clubs is fellowship is life, lack of fellowship is death. Which is, there's something very sort of plain speaking about
Absolute.
that. And there is a fellowship in cycling. You wave, out on the road in the countryside. Generally you sort of acknowledge another person on a bicycle. I suppose much like people who drive camper vans acknowledge other camper van drivers. But then, you get these shrines to cycling, particularly I think in kind of the Alps and the Pyrenees, where the great exploits in bike racing have taken place, and also people are really pleased to have made it to the top themselves. So people want to put stickers up and tie ribbons, and celebrate and take pictures of each other. There's lots of different aspects to that. But I sometimes wonder whether the presence of a cycling culture kind of indicates a problem, that cycling is a kind of subculture and kind of maybe composed of people who are members of an out-group within society at large, which is sort of contributes to the part of the reasons why we get ignored so much, and the potential for cycling for people who don't currently ride bikes to become a country a bit more like the Netherlands, where people, ride their bikes just as a matter of course. And they say in Holland and Denmark, there's no cycling culture because everybody cycles. Like there's no toothbrushing culture in Britain. It's like, everyone brushes their teeth. So it's just an everyday activity. And the cycling culture is, though rich and pleasurable to be part of, maybe a sign of the marginality of cycling as a mode of transport. So it's a sort of double-edged sword in a way, maybe, cycling culture.
Yeah.
And if it's like, if it's expressed as resistance and anger and critical mass and slowing up taxi drivers and bus drivers in town centres and things like that. I mean, I don't know what the experience has been here.
I think it's true. I think it is kind of like an indicator, isn't it, in a way? Yeah.
Cycling culture, or people who think is there a cycling culture in Preston?
I think it'd be kind of interesting. I think I'd kind of argue that there isn't a cycling culture in Preston, but I may be wrong, because it's one of the things that, how do you gauge it? I mean, I'm within Preston, but it's still so hard to gauge. It'd probably be interesting to see what people think and whether there is. I think there's a cycling culture within the area and a racing culture within the area, but I think within Preston, it's, a lot of us do commute, but we're definitely in the minority, and there's not, like you said, that idea of just jumping on your bike to get to somewhere. It's just
to people. I mean, yeah, if people kind of comment on the fact that you've arrived at a work meeting on a bike, and you get that kind of comment of like, oh, you're the cyclist, or aren't you brave, or aren't you clever, or aren't you fit or strong, or something like that, then it's very tiresome, isn't it? It's just, no, I'm not brave, I'm not fit, if I am, it's not relevant to the fact that I've cycled a mile to get to this meeting. It all contributes to that sort of othering of cycling, and the idea that it's not for me, it's for other people, those people over there who jump red lights and don't have lights on their bikes and go down the inside down, go on the inside down, HGVs, and all the kind of tropes that are wheeled out, and don't pay road tax, and all the sort of tropes that are wheeled out at the first opportunity to kind of put people on bikes back in their box whenever they ask for the right not to be killed when they go to work, which is kind of the basic ask, isn't it? But that sounds like a rant.
You're asking a lot. You're asking a lot.
Sounds like a rant.
I think so. We went out on a little cycle ride this morning. It wasn't too bad when we left, I don't think, but it did start raining fairly swiftly. But I mean, I think we still saw quite a lot of people out for a Thursday morning, a wet Thursday morning in Preston. It was sparse, but we saw people on the Guild Wheel, and we saw people out on the road. We saw a chap who was, I think, as shocked to see us as what we were to see him. And at the top of the Trough of Bowland, in a really good downpour, there was lots of, "Are you all right? Are you all right? Yeah, are you all right?" Kind of, we both couldn't really decide.
Yeah.
None of us could decide what we were doing up there. Yeah. But so I think we did, and we saw quite a mixture of people, I think I would say, today.
Yeah, in the city, coming over that cobbled bridge. A goodly number. And on the Guild Wheel, which I wasn't sure what it was. I was imagining when you were talking about it on the phone, I was thinking, is this like a Ferris wheel for bikes? What's going on here? do you get a view of the city from going up in the air on your bicycle? Oh, wow, this is cool. Why have I never heard of this? And then obviously, explained that it's a kind of cycling ring road around the city, a superhighway, circular superhighway, and I enjoyed the bits of it that I did. I think it's a great achievement of a city to especially for something like the Guild Festival, which happens every 20 years, to choose that as its legacy is something that is very unusual in Britain, where local authorities, you'd be dragged kicking and screaming to do anything in terms of cycling infrastructure and walking too. It was really gratifying to enjoy the kind of wide, smooth tarmac surfaces, no motor traffic harassing us. Feeling like we were getting somewhere.
Yeah. It was very nice. I think the Guild Wheel is fantastic. I think it has its issues, and it doesn't tick all boxes. It's certainly kind of like a leisurely loop that you can do of the city that's kind of open to all. I mean, there was parts of it today that I don't remember being as challenging as what they were actually, but they were quite. It was wet, so it was difficult, but there was some
cobbled
quite
sections,
challenging sections.
Yeah, with the barriers in. That was a bit like a kind of cyclocross course, wasn't it?
Yeah, and we had a couple of quite kind of burly mountain bikers warning us of all the spots where there was issues with the cobbles. So, and I think, when you're looking at something like that, and it is like then a 21-mile leisurely loop, that surely then you're expecting to take your kids and anyone can do, maybe of varied experience. It kind of has its limitations, and also then I think as a commuting route it becomes very tricky, because yourself in London, the idea of the commuting route is to take out them stops and to minimise the friction with the things around you. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about London.
I don't know, you don't have to travel too fast to make a journey if it's direct in a period of time that's competitive with alternative modes, whether it's you've got to walk to the bus stop, wait for the bus, get on the bus, and then walk to your destination, or get in a car, find parking, get stuck in traffic, and then get to your destination, find parking. The bicycle doesn't actually have to travel that fast over city length type distances to be competitive or superior to those modes of transport, if the route is like a good direct line, not kind of going all around the houses, up hills, down dales. And I think the danger, or it's often easy for local authorities and highways people to sort of put in the cycle infrastructure in the easy places where they can. They've got an old railway line, like a 3-mile stretch of railway line, and they're like, we'll make a cycle path there. And that's great to take your kids who are learning to ride a bike to kind of toddle up and down, and it's nice for people to walk their dogs on it. Or you have a strip of bike path along a nice wide road that then just stops when the road gets a bit narrower or it goes through a constriction. And the danger with that is that people don't use it enough because it's not useful. So why would they use it? And then people point to it and say, well, look, there's nobody using this cycle path. Why did we waste all that money building a cycle path? Let's not build any cycle paths in the future because they don't get used. So you've got to really look at the journeys that are most commonly made, and that means looking at the city in a functional sense and picking out the nodes around the city and trying to figure out how do you make those connections and what's the desire line, and grasping the nettles where you have to. And that takes massive courage, but is, it's very rarely seen because there's usually very little political kind of payback for doing something like that.
Okay. You kind of spoke a little bit before about the Guild Wheel and what a kind of a great legacy it is for Preston from 2012. I think with that in mind, and I think looking at the figures for like the Guild Wheel as an attraction to Preston, they're really, really high. You know, I think it's like it's either the top or very close to the top of things that attract people to Preston to ride it. Without it being too much of a stretch, we've kind of spoke a little bit about how maybe councils and organisations, authorities can maybe use that as a pull and a drag for maybe some kind of cycle tourism to maybe get that infrastructure into place. Do you think that's a possibility of that kind of thing?
Yeah, I mean,
I know it seems ridiculous as Preston is as it is maybe now, but we've already have this thing as an attraction.
Well, I mean, as well as presenting the radio show and now a podcast, I write these books about cycle touring, basically, got routes, book of routes that people can do in the countryside. Generally, the first one is called Lost Lanes, which kind of captures the idea that it's beautiful lanes where you don't see any cars, and from fantastic pub to fantastic pub, stopping off at interesting places along the way. And I think to kind of maximise the number of people who come and use a route, you've got to kind of, whether it's a route that you've designed yourself or whether it's a piece of infrastructure, you've got to kind of tell an interesting story about it, or make it like a little game, something like that. So if I've got friends who aren't quite so into cycling as I am, and I say, do you want to come out for a bike ride on Saturday? We're going to ride 40 miles and we're going to have a pub lunch or whatever. That's like, okay, that's maybe attractive. But if I kind of say, well, we're going to stop at 8 different kinds of windmill, and we're going to look at this amazing bluebell wood that's just right at this time of year, and then there's a place to go and have a swim in a river. Suddenly, and by the way, we're going to do this one section that is an old pilgrim path across the North Downs or whatever. Then suddenly their kind of eyes light up and they're like, okay, this isn't a bike ride, this is a kind of journey into culture and history and nature that I'm going to do on a bicycle, because that's obviously the best way in which to engage with the landscape and to make that kind of a journey. And then in terms of built infrastructure, I was on there's a route between a canal route between, where is it? Somewhere in Somerset, Bridgewater to Taunton. That's it. And they've got like a replica of the solar system on the path, like a scale model of the solar system with the sun like in the middle of between Bristol and Taunton. And then as you get closer to Bristol or Taunton, you travel past all the planets, and they're actually there as scale models relative to the sun and relative to the distance between them.
Oh, right,
so
okay.
You're cycling, you cycle whatever a mile, and you get to Mercury, and then it's a bit more, and you get to Earth. And I mean, it's sort of it's a bit of a gimmick, but it's quite fun.
Yeah, I imagine it's amazing.
And it gives you a sense of the scale of the solar system.
It'd be quite good for me, actually.
Like
so I have no idea how far
the planets are away from each other, and then also how big the planets are. And so there's other, like, I came across a project where I don't know if you have, on canal towpaths, sometimes they put concrete bars down, like I think where there are surfaces underneath, and sometimes they wobble a little bit, and they're all just like a row of planks. They're planks, aren't they? Concrete planks. But because there's services underneath, like phone lines and gas pipes and whatnot, there's a cavity underneath there. So it's kind of like a marimba, and you, as the bicyclist going across them, are, the sticks, and you ride along this long expanse of planks, and it plays a little tune, a little tinkly tune, because each one's got its own wobble and a certain amount of resonance underneath, and then people were using that principle to create an actual tune way, whereby you rode along something that had been built to play a particular tune.
You could speed it up and slow it down.
And speed it up, play it backwards, going backwards. So I think there are things like that probably, you probably don't have to have too many of them, but little installations that I think attract people. And then obviously you've got things like, a really good cafe that is on the Guild Wheel that people want to go out to because it's just a great destination. I mean, we rode past the wetlands kind of centre.
At Brockholes,
Yeah, that which has looked absolutely stunning. I wish we had time to stop there.
Yeah, that's another great attraction to people.
So
and it's that's one of the attractions that sits right on the Guild Wheel. So they're kind of both hand in hand in a way. It's a great way of getting to it. Is actually, the car park's quite expensive. It's much easier to go by bicycle.
Yeah,
so.
I mean, and if you connect a few of those things, so you think, okay, a day out is going to suddenly be really enriching because we're going to do a bit of bird spotting, and then we're going to play the bicycle marimba, and then we're going to go to a really nice cafe, and it just suddenly becomes this excellent day out that people will travel for. I mean, if you haven't got things like amazing viaducts to ride across, which obviously in some of the Rails to Trails projects, that's what they've got. You ride across an incredible viaduct, and that's just a destination in itself because it's just amazing to get that sort of view. But you can create things.
So I think Preston, for kind of as a city, for all that it's kind of lacking within the city, it has a lot of potential. From the Guild Wheel out almost. I think. I mean, the terrain is in my opinion, obviously I live here, is fantastic. But I mean, what did you think of it today?
I thought it was great.
It's very varied.
It was really kind of gentle cycling, but then when we got to the Trough of Bowland and that climb there, we really felt like we were in the wilds. I certainly did in the rain. And then looking out towards, the lowlands and out towards the sea, it seemed kind of flat and easy country. I mean, you could, one of the things we talked about various different routes that we might do, and could do like the Ribble sea to source or whatever, one way, other way around, and it's about coming up with imaginative ways to. But I mean, ultimately, I think the value of these recreational routes is that they're sort of like a gateway drug into sort of cycling down to the shops to get the milk. You realise you have a really nice day out on the Guild Wheel, and you get your bike and you pump up the tyres and realise how easy it is to get around, and then you start using the bicycle a bit more for everyday activities and things like that, if it's sort of safe and nice to do so.
Yeah.
I mean, they are. If it's just people getting in their cars with their bikes on the back to drive to a sort of leisure facility where they just go back and forth. I mean, that's great in terms of, I suppose, people being active and doing something that's free and democratic and nice, but it's not going to overturn car dominance in our society alone, is it?
It's kind of bizarre, isn't it, really, because you think that this small section that's the city, that's really quite navigable, it's not really any great distance, and yet we're all cycling outside a bit because the roads are much safer and all the congestion is within, but all that congestion within, and it's so navigable. I don't know. It's a really.
It did seem quite in the very little bit of cycling I did in the city centre. It did feel like there were some quite big roads that people are used to, like they've come off a fast road like an A road or a motorway where they've been travelling at 60, and suddenly they're in a kind of city context and they don't adjust their behaviour to that new environment. And the idea that a city centre is a place where the pedestrian is king, the cyclist is maybe prince, heir to the throne or whatever, some little bit lower than the pedestrian, which I agree with. I don't think pedestrians are. Everyone is a pedestrian at some point. Everyone walks. It's and then motor vehicles are kind of guests in that space, and space is allocated accordingly. that you didn't get a sense of that. It felt like there was a lot of space given over to kind of dangerous vehicles ultimately. We overlook the fact that 1,700 people are killed every year on the roads in Britain, and they're not being killed by bicycles. They're being killed by motor vehicles, and a lot more having life-changing injuries as a result of road danger. And so we have an amazing ability to overlook that because we can't imagine a world in which the car is a sort of extension of our identity, our home, our personal space. We've invested a lot of money in it, but we've not just invested money in it, we've sort of invested its emotional baggage. It's a safe, sort of hermetically sealed place, and then the promise of the car industry of total freedom and convenience. I do sometimes wonder if if the driverless car or kind of service-based car, a lease-based car model where you don't own a car, you just own the right to use a sort of fleet of cars like the Zip car or whatever. What's going on out there? Is this drones?
It's the rally.
Or lawnmowers? Really hyperactive lawnmowers. Whether that will change, because if you don't own a car, and the pricing model of a car becomes very much based on the journeys that you make, rather than you pay a big lump sum to have your car, so you can kind of go and see the in-laws at weekends, and then once you've got it, you may as well use it all the time because you've got it, and the cost of petrol's quite low. Whereas if it's this sort of lease type model, you're paying per journey, you might think, well, do I need to make that journey? Like if it's going to cost me £5, rather than cost me an invisible amount, because your petrol gauge is not even going to go down noticeably of having made that journey.
I think our streets would look incredibly different visually, than how they would if you just, if even, you're half the amount of cars on there, and then I think, architecture would come to prominence more, and the sight lines would be, way bigger. It would kind of revolutionise the way we see kind of the urban environment and our residential streets.
We do get a bit of a taste of it when the schools break up. I don't know if you notice as people who drive, and I drive, that when the schools break up, suddenly it's much calmer in the morning and the afternoon on the roads, which it's sort of madness, isn't it? Children used to have the freedom in society to kind of walk to school or cycle to school, and now it seemed too dangerous, so everyone gets in their car to take their kids to school, even if it's only a mile, and then they're obviously contributing to the danger that keeps other people from, cycling. It's a sort of vicious spiral that we're in. Feels like. It's getting dark. Can we make it a bit more positive?
They've done a UK study on why people, the main reasons why people don't use a bicycle more often, and the usual ones are kind of like the weather. I live in a hilly place, or I don't want to get to work sweaty, and the roads are too dangerous. These are the kind of responses that we get back. There's certain aspects, obviously, that it's very difficult for kind of the bike industry, or bicycle culture to kind of tackle. Obviously, things like making the road safe is kind of down to infrastructure and the government. But do you think that things like people getting to work and not being sweaty and having to go up hills and things like that, and obviously people understanding the correct things that they could wear to kind of help them with the weather, or how they can equip their bike to make it better to the weather, things like e-bikes is where I'm going with this. I know that you have one yourself.
Yeah.
How do you think that could...
Well, you just have to go to the Netherlands, and they do have hilly parts of the Netherlands, and there are some hilly places in Germany where there's a lot of people cycling. So hills aren't, an absolute prohibition on cycling in the real world. I think danger on the roads is what it is. People just don't want to feel like they're taking their life in their hands every morning, and quite right too. Getting to work sweaty, well, that again, I think I put that down to the emphasis that is placed upon sport in the imagery associated with cycling, that it looks like it's hard work. You're going to get somewhere. You can get to work sweaty if you cycle really fast and really hard to get there. But if you just cycle, say, 2 or 3 miles at a gentle pace, and you've got gears on your bike, and you're not going to arrive at work sweaty. And what was the other one? What was the other?
Weather?
The weather. Well, yeah, it rains in Holland as well.
Well, it does. Yeah, that is the thing.
And people deal with that, and they have bikes with mud guards.
Umbrellas.
They have how you hold an umbrella up in the air. So I don't know. I think it comes down to danger, and I think if you look at London, where they've built this east-west superhighway that is pretty good actually for Britain. There is build it and they will come in all weathers. I mean, particularly in the sunshine, sure, but when it's raining, people would use that route as well, because the infrastructure is very good. I think that is without that you don't achieve anything.
Yeah. Do you think that the councils or authorities really struggle to provide, or maybe struggle isn't the word. Maybe it's difficult. I'm trying to think of a good way to say it really. Do you think that they're kind of held back by kind of the disparity of cyclists, how different we all are, from a 6-year-old to somebody who's incredibly experienced, and because of that, the infrastructure is just so difficult to make this concise, legible thing, and then the councils just kind of do this interpretation of what they think might.
Well,
always.
Yeah, I mean, again, go to the Netherlands, and it's really good there, and they've been perfecting it for 40 years or so, but they've just done a great job, and it works for everybody. You see roadies on the cycle paths going out of town, you see kids going to school. I think there are some sort of legislative things that are problematic in Britain, that there's certain rules about what highways agencies are allowed to do in terms of, say for instance, you want to put a cycle route along a main road, and you want to give that route priority over traffic that's coming in from side roads, which is a sensible thing to do. The bicycles are on the main road. Just like the cars on the main road, they should have priority over people turning out into the main road. But I think for some reason you can't make that cycle route continuous because of some way in which highways law is, and those things need to be changed. I think there's a massive skills shortage in highway engineering among people who understand best practice.
How have they tackled them on the superhighways in London? That kind of issue of, because it looks, by all the kind of the things I've seen, it is kind of fairly continuous.
Yeah, I mean, it helps the fact that it's beside the river, so it's not got traffic coming across it very often, because it's the river on one side, and so it just goes along there. It has, I mean, there are traffic lights, so there is points where you have to give way, but it's not like you're giving away for every driveway. Yeah. And you have that in the, we've all seen the sort of crap facility of the week, Twitter, and where they, photograph you at the bike path that has a give way sign every 25 metres and a stop sign, and it's just no one's going to want to use that. So, as with all these things, it's sort of you try to make, I think, encourage best practice and reward people that do really well and hold them up and glorify them, and hope that the others feel like they need to up their game. I think there's been a problem with what you were saying about the heterogeneity of cyclists, a very specific problem in that bicycle advocates have often been kind of advocating for the things that they want for themselves, and that they're basically been representing the 2% of people or the 5% of people who already ride bikes, who are by definition a self-selecting group that is very much not representative of the 95% of people who currently don't ride bikes. And so advocacy really needs to focus on the needs of the 95% who don't cycle when they're coming up with new facilities, rather than trying to enhance things for the 5% who already do cycle. I mean, that's just a basic thing that I think has been grasped, certainly by the British Cycling and Cycling UK, and London Cycling Campaign and Cambridge Cycling Campaign and Bristol. I don't know so much about all the cycling campaigns, because sometimes you find that they are dominated by a handful of people who are, they take the view that a bicycle is a vehicle, it should be in the road with other vehicles, the cyclists should be strong enough and fit enough to travel at a speed where they can kind of hold the lane, and people just need training and practice to be able to achieve that, and motorists need to behave better. And that was, for a long time, the prevailing view in cycling organisations, and it's been in America as well, and Australia. And it's been disastrous. It's been absolutely disastrous.
Yeah, and you still do. Like I was saying to you, you still do see it about a lot, and it kind of makes me think almost that we do almost need like this overriding guidebook that's, we all love design and things, and it's actually why do we not have this kind of concise Bible of
there
infrastructure and principles of how we should?
Yeah, there are some gospels out there. The Welsh government, I live in southeast Wales now, and the Welsh government passed the Active Travel Act, which is loudly trumpeted as a world's first, that created an obligation for all local authorities to continuously improve provision for cycling and walking routes in urban areas, and produced a very, very good design guidance. It runs to like 500 pages or something. There's a new one from Transport for London. I think Sustrans, the charity, have got a kind of design manual. The Cambridge Cycling Campaign have got a really good compilation of other people's design manuals. I mean, Manchester Police have got a design manual relating to the cycle parking, right, okay. And various other bits and bobs. So that it is kind of happening. Whether the highways engineers delivering the projects and designing the projects read the manuals is another question. And that in Wales, the evidence is that they've not been reading them. And then by the time they've done it, it's kind of too late to make it meet the standard. And there's no sanction if it doesn't meet the standard. They don't have to sort of give money back or whatever. They just kind of do as they please.
I was going to say, before we take a little break, could I just do like a show of hands for people that do cycle in here?
Oh,
so there's a good portion. And how many people would say that they cycle, what should we say, more than...
Who cycles to get the milk and go to work, and you can do both. So sort of getting around, useful journeys, and more for leisure, recreation, fitness. Yeah, more. Okay. And the people who don't cycle for useful cycling, I mean, obviously getting fit and having a nice time is useful, but you know what I mean in terms of doing the shopping or picking up the kids from school or getting to work. If you don't do that, but you do cycle in the countryside for pleasure and leisure, why not? There's a new book out called Bike Nation by a Guardian journalist called Peter Walker, and I did interview him on the podcast, which is worth a listen. But the book is very much worth a read because it's much wider than our short chat, and he basically goes into the biggest argument that he comes up in favour of promoting cycling and walking is the health one, and the time bomb of obesity, ill health, type 2 diabetes, heart disease is just going to be crushing on the National Health Service, and also creating misery for people who are suffering those things. And if you don't integrate active, and there's an interesting distinction between active travel, which is the jargon that's used now in sort of the policy terms, versus like exercise, and so the exercise is kind of you kind of doing some exercise, whereas active travel is you're taking exercise while you're living your life and doing all the normal things that you do, or you're not just setting aside an hour to go off and do some exercise. You're just the nature and the texture of your life involves you using your body to move yourself around. And because if you think about the way we've evolved, I think we've never been so sedentary and inactive, and we're really reaping the the whirlwind for that transformation.
Should all be stood up, really, shouldn't we?
Yeah. Well, we should all stand up, have a walk around, and then we're going to do sort of more.
Yeah,
people can share their comments.
While we have a little break, I think it'd be really great if you could all have in your minds the routes that you do, and so we can get it down on the map and try and think of all them areas.
People could do that now, right?
Yeah, actually, you could maybe even start it now if it's like got it.
Yeah.
Help yourself. There's a pen up there, the map's up there. Right. If you need a hand with anything, give me a shout. Does anyone have any questions about what we've spoke about already that they'd like to raise?
Or comments or reactions or experience of your own that seems relevant or not relevant?
Yeah. The comment you made right at the end about your opinion on the direction of cycle groups training people to be more doing aerobic training, and how that was destructive, or use it quite negative. Explain what you think about it.
I think cycle training and adult cycle training is a coping mechanism, a necessary coping mechanism for a very imperfect world. You wouldn't need it if there was good infrastructure. I mean, you could have it, but you wouldn't need it. And I think what is destructive is the idea that you don't need infrastructure because you've got training. Training is just a coping mechanism for those people who are kind of ballsy enough to mix with the traffic. And the cycle training zealots will say, well, that's the point of cycle training, is everyone can be ballsy enough to mix it with the traffic. But I would deny any parent who would say, well, my 8-year-old or 12-year-old, they have some cycle training and then they can go off and ride with HGVs on a big ring road. No, they're not going to allow them to do that because the parent instinctively knows that it's not safe for that to happen. And if there were a separated cycle track that couldn't be driven on by an HGV, then I reckon most parents would be happy with their young kids riding on it. So it's the centrality of infrastructure, and it's mistaking a kind of coping strategy for a fundamental strategy. But the ultimate root of it all is the kind of vehicular cycling model, which is that cars are vehicles and they just need to be piloted skillfully and powerfully, and everyone can do that. That's an achievable objective for everybody, which I think is just a mistaken view.
You touched upon electric bicycles, but I was interested in autonomous vehicles. How do you see that development, which seems to be heading towards us very fast, as threats, possible opportunity, whatever, for cycling culture?
Yeah, it's fascinating, isn't it? I wonder how much of it is hype and how much of it is sort of venture capitalists or startup people wanting to get venture capital and wanted to get investment and then sort of boosting the idea of autonomous vehicles. But then my uncle turned up with a Tesla. He's a total petrol head, although he does have an electric bike as well. He just likes vehicles. He just likes going places in vehicles. So he turns up with his Tesla, which he controls with his control in our yard with his mobile phone, make it move forward. And then he said, Jack, walk in front. He was rolling forward, and he said, Jack, walk in front of it. And so I walked in front of it, and it stopped, to let me walk past. And then he drives around and it senses the cars in front and behind and where the road is, and he doesn't have to do anything. He just sits in the front seat and the car steers and changes gear and speeds up, slows down. And yeah, he drives from Gloucestershire to London and doesn't have to really touch the steering wheel, which means that autonomous cars are kind of with us, although he is ultimately responsible for driving a car. At any point he can override it, but it's so good he doesn't really have to. So they're already sort of with us. But oh my God, I mean, the changes that will be wrought by autonomous vehicles just go so far beyond cycling. It's extraordinary. I mean, we'll probably be at the sharp end of it in a way, because you're not going to have autonomous bicycles, probably. Which actually kind of, I think that it's just a time that occurred to me the other day. The attraction of the relative appeal of an autonomous car versus an autonomous bicycle, it's quite revealing about the difference in the experience of driving a car and riding a bicycle. Basically, driving a car is a chore and a hassle, and something, if we can get a robot to do it for us, brilliant.
Yeah,
but riding a bicycle is you're kind of more of like a cyborg creation on the bike. It's you and the machine that sort of become a one thing, and it's an expression of your volition. And the idea of just getting on board a bicycle that pedals itself and steers itself where you want to go, you wouldn't want to do that, would you? Although I know you ride a tandem, so yeah.
That's how we got round today.
But
Jack was on the front.
But I mean, all sorts of issues to do with like legal liability. Who is liable? Does it mean that the bicyclist can finally take the lane because the car is programmed not to beep it, come up behind it, revving, do a close punishment pass, and all that? If 1,700 people are killed every year on the roads of Britain by driven cars and other motor vehicles. I guess the promise of autonomous vehicles is that will come down, because people won't be distracted, they won't be on their mobile phones, they won't be tired, they won't be in a rush, and the robots will make better decisions. But I don't imagine it would come down to zero. And who's responsible for those deaths? Do you sue Google because the robot was programmed wrongly or malfunctioned? There was a glitch in the code that caused it to run over your child. Do you sue the driver? I mean, it's the notional driver, the passenger, ultimately, is what we're talking about, isn't it? Do you sue the passenger in the autonomous vehicle? But then employment. I mean, how many people are employed in the economy driving vehicles up and down? I mean, they're all going to be out of work, aren't they? If they've got autonomous delivery vehicles going around the place and drones landing on. I mean, it's amazing, and I don't know, it's a fascinating subject. It's one I want to cover on the podcast, so keep an eye out when I finally get the good combination of experts. What do you think?
Well, it's a kind of rules for all sorts of things. I mean, I think, personal ownership of cars surely will go down, won't it? It'll be almost like you call it a taxi, so just wonder about the amount of road space required, because the amount of vehicles actually ownership will go down, but then would they be used more because they seem like take the chore away? And would it be more expensive? I don't know, because maybe all this litigation has potential. I don't know. It's mind-blowing when you talk to people about it. You think it's more than just a vehicle driving itself. It's then concomitant sort of like ripple effects into all spheres of our lives. In terms of cycling, I don't know. It would worry me that HGV was alongside me without a sentient being, and me having to trust some algorithm to find me in that space on the road. That would be crazy. And I think therefore, unless that was demonstrably proven to be safer, it would probably be a transition period put people off cycling perhaps. But that's just one.
Yeah, I mean, or if it placed a burden on pedestrians and cyclists to have a kind of beacon that they carry around with them to show that they exist, so that the computer in the car can see that they're there. I mean, that you can imagine that would be a future, a one possible future. And if you didn't carry your beacon, or your beacon ran out of battery, then suddenly you're invisible to the autonomous vehicles. I mean, one thing that is interesting is sort of the parking side of things, because I think 90% of the time cars are parked. They're not on the roads. So that's a huge amount of space. And in an urban context, that's very precious space that is used by stored private property on city streets, by and large. There's some car parks, of course, but obviously car parks take up space that could be used for something else. So there's a tremendous opportunity cost. And then bike lanes. I mean, I interviewed Klaus Bondam, who is the cycling mayor of Copenhagen. They have like 6 mayors of Copenhagen at any one time, and they have different portfolios. And so he was the one for cycling, and maybe, I don't know what other aspects of transport. And he said that was the fundamental culture value clash in urban context, is the battle between bike paths and parking spaces, on-street parking spaces. And it is the kind of third rail in local politics to take away someone's to take away on-street parking, to provide something that's more obviously sort of public benefit, whether it's a plaza to walk on, or a bike path, or some nice trees or whatever. People do not like to give up or have parking removed, and I was talking about people projecting their own ownership and identity into their vehicles. They kind of do that a little bit with the space outside their homes, like on a street. You know, I've had it sometimes. You park outside someone's house, and then they come out and say, "That's my parking space. You can't park there." And it's like, well, no. In our society, you could park kind of anywhere on the street in this street. It's not yours. It doesn't say it's yours. You didn't pay for it and build it. But people get really shirty about that.
To get the deeds out and see where the.
Well, no, it evidently stops at the front door, doesn't it? I mean, but it's this sort of mentality that, you know, and obviously you can't just put a garden shed outside your house in a parking bay. And even if you've got a residence parking system where you have to pay your £60 a year or whatever it is for a parking space that you may or may not have, but then you could just like build a storage unit on the street. I mean, that sounds good. I mean, parking is put your
bike in there.
Massively subsidised, isn't it? Because people aren't charged the real cost of providing that facility for storage. I mean, if cars had always had to be garaged, as they were in the early days, then, you know, we'd have seen a very different evolution of transport, wouldn't we? If you had to have a garage, your own garage to store your car, and you couldn't just store it on the street.
I think it is them accumulative costs, isn't it? When you look at motoring, you know, I think you can do it across lots of things, but when you look at them motoring and you add all them accumulative costs that you don't realise in the background, it becomes ridiculously inefficient.
Well, the costs that are borne by society, you know, the opportunity costs, the direct costs of treating, you know, health conditions associated with sedentary living, the pollution, the diesel particulates are now and the diesel gases are now a big issue, aren't they? I mean, I was on the way up here, and I know it was on the train station, but I had a kind of 35 minutes at Crewe on the platform there, and I was like feeling nauseous and really grim with a headache, and because of the fumes of Crewe, and and I don't know if that was just the station or if that's just the town as a whole, but you know, it wasn't the gases. No, it was definitely the gas, you know, it does. You do start to taste the city. I mean, I don't know, is Preston polluted enough that you can taste it?
There are 1 or 2 roads that are pretty bad.
But in general, it's sort of point locations rather than the general smog. It feels like it kind of gets blown away, and you get nice windy days here, don't you? It doesn't just sit and hang over like a kind of cloud of poison.
Yeah, no. I think on the whole, there's a few, you know, obviously there's a few kind of areas that are probably a bit heavier than others. New Orleans and out towards Broughton maybe are the two heaviest. Which obviously we now have this bypass that's about to arrive in Broughton, where at the minute the traffic is going straight through kind of a small village and crossroads, and hopefully it will soon be then transferred onto this larger road, making hopefully the village a lot more a nicer place to cycle and walk through, because the Guild will actually go straight through there, through that area, and you know, regularly of an evening and of a morning it will be congested.
But will there be measures to further, not just to say, oh, here's a nice way to avoid that, but actually to kind of constrict the flow through Broughton and make it even, actually discourage people from even thinking about going through there? Because that's what you've got to have, otherwise you just induce more traffic, because you just shorten all the journeys and people start making journeys that they didn't used to make because you can do it in 20 minutes less, and so they'll just end up with more journeys.
I think
you're back to where you started with, and you need a bypass for the bypass.
I think that's always the case. You always have these new roads which will alleviate traffic problems and will turn the village back into a village, and not then. But there's always going to be somebody that's going to bypass that road where the traffic is and go straight through the, you know, so it's always going to be the case. And going back to it, then it's always just going to become this increasing problem that doesn't get tackled unless you tackle the problem.
It should be. Needs to be, first of all, politically, there needs to be a kind of quid pro quo with the villagers to say, we're going to build you this bypass, but we're going to make sure that your car journeys are no easier than they used to be. We're going to take out the through traffic, but we're not going to make your driving experience better, and we're going to make sure that it's at least as bad as it is now, if not possibly a bit more difficult. I think, I know it's tricky to do that.
Do you think we become tolerant of bad journeys? Because every time I took a journey in the car, I was stuck in a traffic jam. That's the bit I can't get. You know, trying to persuade people to get on the bikes more, but we seem so quite content to sit in the traffic jam.
What we'll put up with, it's
sort of like used to it.
I think you get used to it when there's no alternative, or where the alternative isn't obvious to you and isn't presented in a way that makes it obvious. And it is a bit like, you know, boiling a frog. You don't notice it getting worse and worse. But if you did a 20-year, went back in time 20 years or went forward in time 20 years, you'd really notice it and you go, oh, this is crazy. We're putting up with really bad stuff now. But as it gets incrementally worse each year, maybe you don't notice it. People factor it in, don't they? They say it's going to take that amount of time. Variable road pricing is sort of seen by economists as a kind of way forward, so that you charge people for using the roads and you vary those charges, and it can all be done with sort of onboard computers and a little dashboard that says, you know, this road is now this much money, and that kind of is supposed to spread out usage in a kind of economically efficient way throughout the day. And people adapt their behaviour and don't make those journeys at that time if they don't really need to make it, and then they're willing to pay. People have problems with that because we're used to motoring being an absolute human right. But then I think it's starting to happen. It's been talked about at least, but I don't know how easy it is to implement, you know, at the micro level. You could certainly do it for certain roads. Or certain toll roads, you could increase the toll, reduce the toll, just to make sure that you don't actually have any queues at the toll stations or on the bridge or wherever it is.
How would those same economists promote cycle use?
I would assume it's the same as everybody else who thinks about it in a rational way, is to make it better as an experience than the alternatives. In a free world, and that can be done by improving cycle infrastructure, and it can also be done by constraints and penalties for using modes which are associated with a lot of negative externalities. And that's a whole load of economic jargon, but basically, you tilt the playing field in favour of the behaviours that you want people to make.
You would think it was a no-brainer for our given that they will preside over the disaster that is visited on the National Health Service, as you referenced earlier.
I don't think
They would be throwing money.
I don't think they think in those timescales.
I always think that kind of thing is always for the short game, and cycling is always such a long game. You know, I think the Dutch model, again, it's not something that happened overnight. It took them 40 years.
Well, they got pretty good in the first 5 or 10 years. But the thing is, how do you achieve a 25% modal share of transport for cycling, which is what the Dutch have got? Well, you start with a 50% modal share, which is what the Dutch had in the 1950s and 1940s. So ultimately, they just slowed the decline of cycling and held it, you know, at a constant at 25% by providing world-class, amazing infrastructure. And the Dutch have still got cars. They still use their cars. I think the car ownership rates aren't any higher. They do have big taxes on big cars. I think the tax is based on the axle weight of the car. So there's a strong incentive to drive a small car, which, you know, we were out on the lanes, weren't we? And, you know, the cars coming towards us were so big.
Like a HGV Kiss at one point as the...
Well, the HGV is one thing, but it was more like the BMW X5s and those sorts of things. They're so wide, and on a country lane, they take up a lot of space, and they were like straying over the central line into sort of our path because they're just very big cars. And now, if that I think it was in the Netherlands, you know, you pay €5,000 a year tax on a SUV type car. You pay whatever 600 on a, I don't know, Nissan Micra or some sort of a Golf or some small car. I think they consider other things than you know, to influence choices that people make over what car they're gonna drive. And they don't provide parking like in front of the house. They kind of they have the cars around the back, which is another little thing. You know, it's a little bit of a way. You've got to bring your car, or garages, you've got to bring your car out of the underground garage to drive. Well, that's a hassle. I'll get on the bike. But we have it the other way around, where we sort of make it a hassle to ride a bike rather than, you know. So, but I think it's just politicians, maybe leader of the council can elaborate on this, but they very rarely think in terms of, you know, making radical change when the payoff or the disaster that that they need to avert is 30, 40 years ahead. I mean, look at climate change, and habitat loss and species loss and all those things, and look at obesity. You know, the children who are now clinically obese. I think in Wales it's like by the time of they're 8, it's kind of 30%, 35% are overweight or obese by the time they're 8. The real costs of that are not going to be borne for another 30, 40 years maybe. And who's going to be standing for election then? Who's standing for election now? So I don't know, what's this? How do you make politicians think in the long term and do hard decisions for the benefit of the long term?
Yeah, it's very, very difficult. I mean, some years ago, government took public health out of the National Health Service and gave it to local authorities. And that was a great move. But a couple of years down the line, what government then did was say to councils, right, we're cutting your grant for public health because of austerity. National politicians in particular are very, very short-sighted because it seems, that's an easy thing to cut. That's an easy thing not to spend money on. I'm not taking a long-term view that if you don't spend money on public health issues, including things like cycling, you're just going to rack up health problems for the population. So you're absolutely right. Yeah, they're not worried about what's happening in about 10 years now because they won't be around.
But it's the whole thing is that the view long term is that we are living longer anyway. So, you know, the long term view is, even if you, like you say, you know, putting it off now, you know, not looking at a long term view, well, affording everything is always going to be an issue now for society, isn't it? Because the sort of burden of people living longer, it's always going to be there. And society is always now going to have to work out how it affords to keep everyone affords. And although it's brilliant to think of you know, everyone sort of becoming healthier and fitter, it compounds the issue because then we'll live even longer. Yeah.
But maybe the way to live and the kind of cost-effective way to live, and I guess it doesn't affect, it's not things like pensions, but in terms of healthcare costs, is, you know, you're fit and healthy, and then you're out for a bike ride and you just drop dead and die at the age of 85 or whatever, and that's great. Like, I mean, like Rhodri Morgan, the former First Minister of Wales, was out on a bike ride and died. Of a heart attack, I think, and I was looking at some Dutch statistics for kind of fatalities and injuries, and when they occurred, who they occurred to, and there was this big spike in like older cyclists dying, and I was going, what's all that about? And I think it revealed the fact that actually that there are very few people, in terms of per mile ridden, die or are injured in the Netherlands because the infrastructure is so good and so safe. And it really was just older people just keeling over, cycling into the canal. And you know, I mean, what a way to go. I'm up for that. I mean, you know, I don't want to go into care
Beryl
home for
Burton
10 years and have a miserable life. I want to just die on the bike.
You're close today at times, I think.
When you were putting the hammer down,
No, yeah.
and I couldn't hold your wheel, it's true.
I think it, yeah.
And I was a bit nervous about going out. You do get this nerve of going out for a bike ride with someone who you've not met before, because you kind of wander and you kind of like eye them up and check out the sort of line of their calf and if they look whether they shave their legs. I couldn't tell because you were wearing tights. But do you shave your legs?
No.
But then the surname Renshaw was a little bit of a problem because he's Mark Renshaw is a very fast cyclist. So I was wondering if maybe there's some gene pool of the Renshaws that you're going to.
And then you sighed as soon as you got.
Then I tear my legs off. But you were very charitable. And yeah.
No, it's yeah. I think there's a long list. I think
we've got a little revival of our weather this morning.
Yeah. Sorry. No, go on.
Being able to just rent a bike and just pick up a bike. I know recently in Manchester we've got this new bicycle thing. I don't think it's going totally to plan, but it's quite new. But kind of being able to go short distance with a visiting, being able to run, you know, and get a bike and then go further out. And it's a pity we don't have anything, you know.
Yeah.
The main train line in Preston, and you've got guests. You know, you don't bring your bikes.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Just like this basic infrastructure we need to then explore.
Yeah, I mean, is there a bike hire place on the Guild wheel?
Yeah, there is at the station.
At the hub.
Train station down at Hull. So for people commuting in and also just regular use, leisure to open the hub there. So you can commute and rent a bike. For example, if someone's coming on the train rather than having to walk to work.
I'm thinking more of like, you know, go to London. I mean, when I went to London recently, you know, my best experience was just being able to get the bike out, you know, and you know, you've got the docks and all these different places, and not really knowing where you're going. You want to use the bike to explore, and knowing that I can put it here. And it was just really nice to be able to cycle around Hyde Park and get to the Park. You've got your own cycle lane, you've got the cars there, there's a division,
Yeah, I mean, there's lots of things related to that. The one in Manchester, I think, is interesting because they don't have docking stations, so you just leave it where you want, and it sort of immobilises. And that they say that was the first one, but actually there was a Berlin one that was run by Deutsche Bahn a few years ago. I don't know if it's still around, where you could do the same sort of thing, and you just leave it where you finished your journey, and then you just pick one up. Which means that it's very easy to set up. You don't have to take out space from the street, build these things, plumb them in to the network. It's all done wirelessly, and can be done for much lower cost. I think you've got to start with a big enough number that it creates the expectation that you can always find one. Otherwise, you kind of made the journey in the morning on one, and then you can't find one to get home at night. And at least when there are docking stations, you know where you're going to find them. I suppose with apps and stuff like that, you could probably, like with the Uber, you can see where they all are, and you can walk to your nearest one. Okay. Yeah. Those are some of the. Yeah, I mean, I think there's another issue. There's two big positives from those town bike schemes. The first one is a very, very rudimentary one. It is a very visible statement by the town or the city where they have it to say cycling is a legitimate form of transport, and we're providing something very obvious and quite glossy and sexy for people to use to cycle. And that's a big, powerful statement for having been through so many decades when it's just been invisible or ignored, or just something, a relic from the past, an anachronism. And then the other one is you get a different kind of person riding a bike. So there'll be people, in business clothes, in just everyday clothes. There won't be the Lycra brigade who are doing long distances at high speed, maybe doing a bit of training along the way. Nothing wrong with that. But it does present an image of cycling that says you've got to be like me in order to do this. Whereas if you see, someone, dressed for work, someone, whatever, dressed for just everyday life, riding a town bike, you just think, well, okay, the cycling it's doable. I don't have to be like a road warrior. I just check out one of these things and off I go. And the helmet issue, we haven't talked about helmets, which is brilliant. That people don't tend to wear helmets very much, which I know is controversial, but it is, again, sending out a sort of message that you don't need lots of paraphernalia to use a bicycle. So no, town bikes are great. We're going to have them for Preston, do you think? We're going to get one of those things they've got in Manchester for Preston. I mean, the other great thing is that it also creates this sort of sense of competition among mayors, and it's like Paris has got one, we need one. New York's got one. Oh man, we've got to have one. We've got to have one that's better than their one, because it becomes a kind of badge of civic pride and virtue, doesn't it?
The way I actually saw Paris going on their bike, and I've never been there.
Yeah.
It wasn't for their bikes. I wanted to probably see what I saw. So I think it's quite, very basic.
Yeah.
We're probably not big enough for it.
Right.
Ours are going to be electric. Electric, yeah. Sorry.
Blackpool one is better folded.
Well, not enough usage, or
And they get mixed tattoos, and they've got the front on that, so they've got easy places for it.
yeah. Okay.
Andy?
That's what I could just draw that debate, because I think Preston's now a city, has been a city for quite some time. It's never really found its identity truly out of the way. I was wondering whether cycling could be could be the cycling city of the north.
Well, I was kind of, to a certain degree, we did speak about that. It's kind of, obviously with things like the Guild Wheel, which we spoke about, which is kind of like the legacy, but also it's how many people are aware of how many great cyclists that we've got come from this city and nearby, and then have used this terrain as their training ground. We've got Hugh Carthy, who's a Preston lad who now rides for professional team Cannondale, and we've got Ian Bibby, and we've got James Gullen just up the road. And so there's a lot of professional or elite level cyclists within the area, and I think it's kind of, I know it's difficult because we're still going down that racing route, but surely there's something there
I
within
don't
the
know. I
terrain
think they're,
from a
I think they're
landscape
the wrong,
perspective.
Yeah, maybe from that sort of outside in the countryside. And Yorkshire has done very well on that with their Tour de France, and then promoting, and the cycling club memberships are blossoming over there. I think there's a danger when you hold up, Bradley Wiggins and say, now you can cycle to work. Like you wouldn't get Mo Farah to promote a walk to school campaign for children, would you? You just want sort of ordinary people who are just like you. You don't want supercharged athletes who are, by definition, just not like you, because they are the elite of the elite, and they do things that none of us could even conceive of doing. And sometimes I have to say they come out with some pretty bad
There is that
sort of lines on, and then they say, oh yeah, these noddy cyclists who don't know what they're doing on their Boris bikes, and they are a little bit elitist in their view of who is a legitimate cyclist and who's not. And the one big exception to that is Chris Boardman, who is former world hour record holder, stage winner in the Tour de France.
And
great
regional
cyclist.
feet reasonably, what Wirral.
Yeah, I mean he's now the policy sort of lead for British cycling, and does an amazing job whenever he's kind of on the TV or the radio or in the press about arguing for better conditions for cycling and not doing it from the kind of sport perspective. He's fantastic.
Yeah, no, I think that's true. I think I was thinking more in the landscape, typical. Just thinking about it. Yeah.
It is. It's the surrounding terrain of the city that it's easy to get out in it, but it's easy to get into it as well. I know there's a few issues on the map people are pointing out. It's actually pretty good compared to a lot of cities, and I just think it's ideal.
Yeah, I mean you don't seem to have what you get in a lot of places, cities, where you've got a reasonably potentially accessible city centre and some great lanes and terrain in the countryside, but then you've got this kind of donut of inaccessibility that you've got to break through, and is very off-putting because it's probably development that has happened in the city in the era of the car, where the planners have all just planned for cars and provided for cars, and that's all there is. And without good routes through that sort of barrier, you never link the countryside to the town. And Britain tends to focus, British planning rules tend to focus on a green belt to kind of constrain the growth of a city, which is kind of good because it forces sort of denser development and gives people breathing space and all that in the countryside. I don't know if Preston's got a green. Have you got a green belt legislatively? Is there a green belt? Yeah, you're building on it. Okay, but what you need, as well as a green belt, is you need green wedges to kind of to come into the centre.
But we have, I mean, this wonderful park here. I mean, you're within spitting distance of the centre of the city.
Yeah.
Just to this park.
Yeah, I mean, it does seem like you're quite ahead of other places in that respect of being relatively permeable, with sort of a certain amount of intervention needed at the hotspots, but it's not like it's a kind of, oh my God, where do we even start with this? Which you feel like in a lot of other places, you feel like it's a mountain to climb.
Yeah, but I think with that said, there's a surprisingly invisible amount of cycle lanes. There is barely any in Preston. When you look at a map and you just then highlight the cycle lanes, they really are very few and far between, and the ones that are there are, like we spoke about, can be a bit dubious. So we need to work on some kind of spokes or somewhat kind of way of moving around the city by bicycle that is safer than what it is now, or work on
or just controlling the car, the way the cars use the city streets, and just slowing it all down, and dealing with the short-term pain where everyone goes, oh man, it's even worse to drive a car in the city centre, and then reap the rewards when they just stop. But that's the thing that no one wants to do, is that little short-term pain of, God, you've made it even worse for us.
Yeah, we
we've had a sort of experiment Fishergate, which is interesting, restricting traffic, making it more pedestrianised.
How's that worked?
It's great for a pedestrian.
I love it.
Yeah. I think it's changed the whole feel of the place.
And what do the traders think? What do the shopkeepers and businesses think?
Oh, they like it. Yeah.
They like it? Because that's usually the argument against.
They're getting more people because the pavements, it was 2 lanes went to 1 lane, so you've now got much bigger pavements. So people have got, cafes have got more chairs out there. Over the weekend it's busy.
Car drivers don't like it.
No, well, we don't care.
Yeah, the car has its place, doesn't it? I mean, the car does have its place.
And it's not even your jurisdiction either, because we're a 2-tier council, so a county council stuff.
Right, okay.
So, sorry, do you want to say anything?
I'll just say that Fishergate, because there's a lot less traffic now than there was before.
Yeah.
Rush hour, cars everywhere, and you queuing.
Well, that's the thing. You don't need to have dedicated cycle lanes when you've reduced car traffic to a certain number, and there is a specific number on this, like a certain number per hour of movements and a certain average speed. So I think it's something like, I don't know, I don't want to quote it and get it wrong, but it's, I think, something like 2,000 vehicle movements. It can't be an hour, maybe a day. I don't know. There is a figure on it that if you get down to that level, then suddenly cars start behaving as if they're guests in the space. Bicycles can use that space, and that sounds like a case in point.
How do you cope with the strange kind of free-for-all giveaway roundabout? I'm not sure what it is, kind of. You just go for it.
Well, it's quite wide.
Yeah.
Still go around the outside. So
Yeah.
yeah, that sort of calming, that it works. As a pedestrian, it works. And as a motorist,
Do you think that kind of everybody's kind of wondering what they should do here, so there is a bit more of consideration from all parties?
I mean, that's the shared space sort of theory. It only works when car throughput is reduced below a certain level. Otherwise, cars dominate. And there's a very expensive shared space scheme in West London on Exhibition Road outside the Science Museum. And it's a disaster. It's a huge amount of spending on beautiful granite paving, and planters and all this kind of new street furniture, and it's just the same car-dominated space that it ever was, because they haven't taken the traffic away and put it and diverted it off. And if you don't do that, then your shared space is just going to be a failure. But they're very fashionable now, so everyone wants to have a shared space in their local authority.
It's a shared space. The shared space is when it's level all the way across, which is what Exhibition Road.
Yeah.
We actually have a small.
it's just changed.
Well, the blind and visually impaired people don't like a small curb because they can't see it and they trip over it. So there's a problem there.
They don't like it. That's why there is a curb, because of the partly sighted blind people.
But they don't like a short. They like a nice high curb that you can put a ball along or whatever, which is a totally fair point. It's hard to get it right for everyone. Yes. 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 Yes.
But there are discussions about having spokes, because part of the city deal about infrastructure is looking at things for the wait to see if they're here.
Yeah, and some of the things actually that you mentioned do sound interesting for us. Certainly connecting the periphery of the city to the centre, because I think that's what we kind of all struggle with, and you can then use them to access, across town and things. But at the minute, it is quite difficult, and I think even as an experienced cyclist, it's a scary thing. I think travelling by bicycle through Preston. I think you wouldn't go around Preston with your kids on a bike. Well, you could go on the Guild Wheel. It's fantastic.
Well, when I was in full-time employment before I retired, I used to try and encourage my work colleagues to come in and bike. And that was the problem. It was, it was scary for people on main roads. So if you couldn't avoid the main roads, it's an issue. So I mean, one of them is the canal that runs almost from the centre of the city right out to the northwest, where there are new housing estates. The plans to build to widen and make better the toolpath as
And then
acceptable for cyclists.
I take it there'll be kind of forks off that to the estates, because I know that some of them estates then do have kind of cycling infrastructure kind of worked into them.
Yeah, I mean the new estates, the cycling has been designed into the infrastructure. It's good.
You say design in, what does that actually mean?
Well, unfortunately, it doesn't mean gold medal cycle routes, but it means that cyclists are considered for once.
Is that white lines on the road or is it segregated?
There's an element of both. There's an element of cycle tracks that will go through a lot of these estates. As you get
I think
up at Cotton.
I think I've seen them. I think they are completely isolated lanes, almost like the, to a certain degree, a bit like what comes off the Guild Wheel to a certain degree. So it is like a completely separate from the road path. Yeah, we need to wrap up. I'm aware of that. Thank you very much for coming, everyone. If anyone has put any information on the map that I might not be able to decipher or they want to elaborate on it, quick, come and grab me and fill me in before you leave, if possible. But
perhaps before we do go, though, we should thank
you and
Jack.
Yeah, no, definitely. Yeah.
Well,
thank you very much, Jack.
You thank Jack, but we wanted to thank you as well.
I've been thanking him all day, haven't you? Yeah. Cheers for coming.